Hope your lipstick doesn't fog up that scope, princess. That's what Sergeant Blackwood said to Victoria Carter at Fort Mason. They called her a PR stunt, just another pretty face. But what they didn't know was that she carried the legacy of a legendary sniper in her blood. When real hostiles invaded, she didn't flinch. She moved like the desert wind, calm, quiet, and lethal. 7 enemy soldiers fell to her steady aim, and the truth she had kept hidden all along. Stay with us because this is a story about quiet strength, quiet dignity, and how one woman's silent resolve turned the tide. Welcome to Grateful Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. Under the scorching sun of Fort Mason, Arizona, the dust and heat swallowed everything in sight. The wind carried a dry, relentless weight, and the air shimmered above the desert floor. Corporal Victoria Carter had learned early how to breathe through the heat and keep her focus sharp. She was 26, a Montana native with quiet strength in her bones. Her grandfather, Colonel Joe Carter, had taught her the weight of a rifle and the purpose of each breath taken behind a scope. His legacy was in her hands, even if no one here believed it. The barracks buzzed with tension every morning. She rose before dawn, her boots crunching against the hard-packed dirt, her steps steady despite the laughter that always seemed to follow her. They called her the Princess of PR, a soldier in name but a photo on a recruitment poster to them. Sergeant Ryan Blackwood was the loudest voice among them. He stood tall and broad-shouldered, the sun gleaming off his medals as he barked orders and insults with equal ease. His eyes cut through Victoria every time she moved, as if her presence was an inconvenience he couldn't forgive. The others, Jackson, Webb, and Thompson, watched and waited. Their doubt didn't come from cruelty but from the whispered rumors that surrounded her name. A woman in a man's world, a mark on their roster, not a fighter in their eyes. Victoria said nothing. She just kept moving. She stripped and cleaned her rifle each morning like a ritual, her grandfather's voice a low hum in her mind. "You don't shoot to prove yourself," he had told her. "You shoot to defend those who can't." She didn't need their approval. She needed the steady rhythm of breath and the weight of her weapon, the way the steel met her shoulder and grounded her in silence. The sun was brutal, turning the firing range into a shimmering mirage. Sand stuck to sweat and clung to skin. Victoria always carried an extra canteen, and when Jackson's water ran out on a long march, she passed hers to him without a word. She didn't expect a thank you. She just knew what it meant to stand beside someone thirsty. There was an old veteran named Harris who worked in the armory. His hands shook from age and old wounds, and the storage shelves he tended had splinters that bit at his palms. Victoria noticed one evening after drills. She stayed behind, using a hammer and nails to brace the loose boards and smooth the edges until the wood was kind to his grip again. No one saw her do it. No one clapped or praised her, but Harris did, in his quiet way, offering a nod the next morning that spoke volumes more than words. Back in the barracks, Blackwood's voice was the soundtrack of doubt. "Hope your lipstick doesn't fog up that scope, princess," he sneered, loud enough for everyone to hear. The others laughed, not with cruelty but with relief, a chance to join the stronger voice and stay safe. Victoria ignored him. She kept her head down, her hands moving with precision as she loaded each round, each motion a promise to herself that she belonged here. She remembered her grandfather's hands, calloused and certain, showing her how to adjust the sights to the wind's quiet howl. The days blurred together in heat and sweat. She learned to find the silence beneath the noise and the crack of a rifle, in the quiet moment before the trigger pulled. She learned to let Blackwood's words wash over her like the desert wind. She had no space in her mind for bitterness, only for breath and steel and the promise she carried in her blood. At night, when the others crowded the mess hall and traded stories of past deployments, Victoria sat alone at the edge of the room. She listened more than she spoke, her fingers tracing the worn letters of her grandfather's last letter, folded small and kept in the breast pocket of her uniform. Sometimes she would stand outside beneath the stars, the desert cold on her cheeks, and remember the stories he told her when she was a child. about how bravery wasn't the loudest voice in the room, about how real courage was the quiet choice to stand when it was easier to kneel. She carried those lessons like armor. She carried them in every step, in every breath she took that no one noticed. When Blackwood watched her, his eyes narrowed with contempt. Victoria didn't meet his gaze. She just kept her focus. She polished the barrel of her rifle until it gleamed softly in the fading light. She adjusted the sights, checked the stock, and found comfort in the familiar weight. Each small act was a prayer in motion, a promise to herself and to the memory of the man who had taught her that some battles were won long before the first shot was fired. The desert night was cold, the sky clear and endless. In the barracks, the laughter faded with the last of the day's light. Victoria lay awake, the letter clutched in her hand. She read the words again, her grandfather's voice alive in the ink. "You don't need to shout to be heard, little soldier," he had written. "The world will hear you in the things you do, not the things you say." She closed her eyes and let those words settle deep inside her. Tomorrow would be another day of drills and doubt, another day of proving nothing to the men who thought her presence was a stain on their pride. But she didn't need their belief. She had her own, and that was enough. In the dark, Victoria breathed slow and steady, the weight of her promise wrapped around her heart like a shield. The world beyond Fort Mason slept. But she was awake, ready to stand for those who couldn't, ready to be more than the rumors whispered in the sun-baked sand. She would let her actions speak, louder than any words, and in that quiet conviction, she found her strength, the strength that no one could take from her. The strength that came not from proving herself to others, but from never doubting the quiet power she carried within. As dawn broke over Fort Mason, the desert's chill gave way to the brutal heat of another day. The training field was a blur of sweat and shouted commands. Dust rose with every footfall, and the air tasted of iron and determination. The instructors barked orders without mercy. 8 graduates would emerge from this program, no more. The rest would return to their units, their dreams of sniper designation left behind in the sand. Victoria rose before the others, her gear already prepared. She moved through the drills with measured precision, her breath even, her focus unwavering. The weight of the day ahead sat heavy on her shoulders, but she carried it in silence. Sergeant Blackwood loomed like a shadow over the class. His words cut sharper than the wind that whipped across the range. "Carter," he called out in the middle of the lecture hall, his voice laced with contempt. "If you're so sure of yourself, walk me through the ballistics of a 1-200-meter shot in crosswind." Victoria stood, her heart steady despite the eyes of the room fixed on her. She spoke calmly, adjusting for wind speed, elevation, and humidity. She accounted for everything except the weight of Blackwood's stare. "Not bad," he sneered, "but you forgot the Coriolis effect at this latitude." Laughter rippled around the room, but Victoria only nodded and sat back down. In the field, the test grew harder. Each mile was a battlefield of dust and will. Victoria moved with quiet purpose, helping Jackson adjust his scope, showing him how to steady his breath in the gusting wind. She didn't do it for recognition. She did it because that's what her grandfather had taught her: kindness without expectation. Jackson was young, his hands trembling on the trigger. "I'm no good at this," he whispered once, his eyes downcast. Victoria placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice low. "Breathe, Jackson. In slow, out slow. The shot will find you if you're patient." Webb struggled with the weight of his gear, shoulders bowed under the strain. Late one evening, when the others had gone to the mess hall, Victoria stayed behind. She found him in the shadows, frustration in every movement as he tried to adjust a loose scope mount. Without a word, she knelt beside him and tightened the screws with practiced hands. "Thank you," he murmured, but she just shook her head. "Focus on the shot," she said. "Let the rest go." Blackwood watched all of this with a smirk that never reached his eyes. He didn't miss a single moment. his barbs growing sharper, his orders more exacting. "You think your quiet little good deeds will save you?" he asked her one morning, his breath hot in the cold dawn. "This isn't charity work, Carter. It's war." Victoria didn't answer. She simply packed her rifle with calm efficiency, the steel glinting beneath the sun. She carried her grandfather's letter folded small in her breast pocket, his words a quiet echo in her heart. One night, long after the others had drifted to uneasy sleep, Victoria sat alone by the light of a single lamp. She unfolded the letter and traced each word with her fingertips. "Kindness isn't about reward, little soldier," it read. "It's about making sure the world still has a corner of warmth left." She read it again and again until the words felt like a shield around her soul. The infiltration exercise arrived with the first blush of dawn. Teams were assigned, tension coiled tight around every breath. Blackwood's voice cut through the silence. "Carter, you're with me," he said, his smile thin and cold. "Any objections? No." "Sergeant," Victoria replied. Her voice was steady, but inside, her resolve hardened like tempered steel. The objective was clear: reach the target undetected across 3 miles of jagged desert. Victoria studied the map, her eyes tracing the safe route along the dry riverbed. "The low ground here," she said quietly. "It'll keep us out of sight." Blackwood's laugh was harsh. "We're not crawling like snakes today. We go direct, over the ridge." She hesitated, weighing his authority against the certainty in her gut. "Sergeant," she said, voice even, "it's exposed for nearly 1,000 meters." "Are you giving orders now?" he snapped, his eyes narrowing. Victoria swallowed her protest and fell in behind him. They moved out at sunrise, the desert a maze of light and shadow. The heat shimmered in waves as they climbed the ridge, the air so thin it burned in her lungs. Victoria felt every scrape of rock beneath her palms, every shifting grain of sand under her boots. They were spotted within 90 minutes. An observer's sharp eye caught the glint of Blackwood's scope, and the radio crackled with their elimination. Blackwood's jaw tightened as they trudged back to the assembly point. "Some people just don't have what it takes," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. Victoria said nothing. She kept her gaze on the horizon, the weight of failure a stone in her chest. But that night, while the others laughed and jeered, she returned to the range alone. She lay prone in the cold sand, adjusting her sights until the crosshairs were steady and true. Webb found her there in the dark. "You're still going?" he asked, his voice quiet. She just nodded, eyes fixed on the distant target. "It's not about them," she said softly. "It's about being ready when it matters." In the weeks that followed, Victoria's quiet acts of help continued. She found Thompson in the armory, struggling with a misaligned bolt. She showed him how to clear the jam, her hands sure and patient. She noticed Jackson's boots, cracked and worn, and slipped an extra pair of socks into his locker when no one was watching. These were the things no one saw. These were the things that didn't make it into the training reports. But in the dark moments before sleep claimed her each night, they were the things that kept her going. Blackwood's tests grew harder. He threw question after question at her during lectures, each one more complex than the last. She answered them as best she could, her voice calm even when her pulse thundered in her ears. He found ways to cut her down with a word, a glance. But she didn't flinch. She didn't let him see the doubt he tried to seed in her heart. Instead, she found her strength in the quiet, in the way she adjusted a sight for a shaking friend, in the way she shared her canteen in the heat of the day, in the way she remembered her grandfather's voice when the world seemed too sharp to bear. At night, she read his letter again by the flickering light. "Tute hong fai jijokin, tute laja the gyoy nai van kon mo chutamap." The words hummed in her chest, anchoring her when everything else threatened to slip away. In the dust and sweat of Fort Mason, Victoria Carter carried her grandfather's legacy like a quiet promise. She moved with purpose, with patience, with the kind of strength that didn't need to be shouted to be real. And in the hush of the desert night, she found the resolve to keep going. no matter how many times the world tried to tell her she didn't belong. The night before the final test, Fort Mason was still and hushed under the desert sky. Stars burned cold above the quiet tents, and the air held a sharp chill that crept under every seam of cloth. Victoria sat on her bunk, her rifle resting across her knees like an old friend. Blackwood approached with heavy steps, his shadow long in the dim light. He didn't bother with a greeting, his voice flat and cold. "Tomorrow," he said, his words deliberate. "There won't be a safety net for you. Carter, there won't be a place to hide." Victoria looked up at him, her expression calm. She didn't argue. She didn't flinch. She just nodded once and returned her focus to the barrel of her rifle, polishing it with a steady hand. Blackwood's eyes narrowed, but he didn't push further. He turned and walked away, leaving only the echo of his warning in the darkness. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Victoria lay awake, her grandfather's letter clutched in her hand, the words a quiet hum in her thoughts. She remembered every line, every promise. She carried them like armor. The next morning dawned cold and bright, the Nevada mountains looming like silent sentinels over the training ground. Teams gathered at the landing zone, the blades of transport helicopters slicing through the air in a low, steady thrum. Victoria moved with quiet precision, her gear checked and double-checked. Blackwood assigned the teams with clipped efficiency, his tone even sharper than usual. Victoria found herself with Webb, Thompson, and Jackson, the same men she had shared countless quiet moments with in the long weeks of training. Blackwood took command without hesitation, his voice cutting through the noise of rotors and shouted orders. As the helicopters lifted off, Victoria sat still, her rifle case braced against her boots. She watched the landscape roll out beneath them, dry gullies and rugged ridges carved by time and wind. Her breath was slow and even, her mind calm despite the tight coil of anticipation in her chest. They touched down in a narrow valley, the earth hard and cold under their boots. The mission was simple in theory: infiltrate, secure intelligence, extract. In practice, it was a labyrinth of shadows and shifting sand, every step a test of skill and will. Hours into the operation, the radio crackled with a sudden, urgent transmission. "Control to all units. Code black. Repeat. Code black." The words cut through the air like a blade. Real hostiles. Real bullets. No more simulations. Blackwood's face went pale, his eyes flickering with something Victoria hadn't seen before. Real fear. He barked orders, his voice ragged at the edges. Get to cover, stay low, but his commands were scattered, his focus fractured. The first shot cracked across the ridgeline, a sharp report that echoed through the valley. Webb cried out, clutching his shoulder, blood already staining his sleeve. Chaos erupted as the team scrambled for cover, dust and stone exploding under enemy fire. Victoria didn't hesitate. She dropped to the ground, her breath steady as she scanned the ridge through her scope. She saw the glint of a rifle barrel, the flicker of movement behind a tangle of brush. Her finger tightened on the trigger, and the world narrowed to the steady beat of her pulse. One shot, clean and precise. The hostile crumpled silently, his weapon slipping from lifeless fingers. She shifted her aim before the echo faded, already tracking the next threat. Blackwood shouted again, his voice hoarse, but Victoria barely heard him. She moved with a quiet calm, her focus absolute. Webb was bleeding beside her, his breath ragged, and she shifted to shield him from the worst of the fire. 2 more shots, quick and sure. 2 more bodies dropped into the dust. Around her, the others looked up in stunned silence, their disbelief swallowed by the crack of her rifle. Blackwood's hands trembled as he tried to raise his weapon, his shouts turning to orders that made no sense. Victoria didn't wait for him to find his footing. She moved, sliding across the rocks to a better vantage point, her eyes cold and clear. The ridge fell silent as the last of the hostiles dropped. 7 lives taken with the same quiet precision she had learned at her grandfather's side. 7 lives that would not threaten her team again. Victoria rose slowly, her rifle steady in her hands. Blackwood stood frozen, his face pale, his mouth open, but no sound coming out. Webb stared at her, blood still dripping from his shoulder, awe and something like gratitude in his wide eyes. Victoria's voice was soft when she finally spoke, the words carrying in the hush that followed the gunfire. "My grandfather," she said, her eyes meeting Blackwood's with calm finality, "was Colonel Joseph Carter. He taught me that it doesn't matter who sees or knows what you do, only that you do it for the right reasons." Blackwood swallowed hard, his voice lost in the silence. Around them, the desert held its breath. Victoria knelt by Webb, her hands steady as she checked his wound. She tore a strip of cloth from her sleeve and pressed it against the bleeding, her touch firm but gentle. Webb winced, but didn't flinch. He looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time. The others gathered close, their movements careful and quiet. Jackson handed her a bandage, his hands still shaking. Thompson hovered behind them, his rifle loose in his grip. No one spoke. Victoria worked in silence, her breath slow and sure. There was no pride in her eyes, no hint of triumph. Only the quiet resolve that had always guided her hands. When the bandage was secure, she looked up at the team, her gaze steady. "We move together," she said softly. No one gets left behind. No one argued. They fell in around her, their steps measured, their weapons ready. Even Blackwood nodded, his usual arrogance stripped away by the weight of what they had just seen. They moved out across the valley, the sun burning low on the horizon. The air was still sharp with the scent of dust and spent powder, but the tension that had clung to them for weeks had shifted. In the quiet glances, in the small nods, there was something new, something unspoken but real. Victoria led the way, her shoulders squared, her rifle resting light but ready in her hands. She didn't look back at the bodies they left behind. She didn't need to. She carried the weight of what she had done in the calm set of her jaw and the quiet steadiness of her breath. They reached the extraction point just as the sun dipped behind the peaks, the last light painting the desert in streaks of gold and red. Helicopter rotors thrummed in the distance, a promise of safety, of home. But in that final stretch of silence, the team knew they had seen something rare. Not in the way Victoria fired her rifle, but in the way she moved without hesitation, in the way she protected without question. In the way she showed them that heroism doesn't always roar. Sometimes it speaks in the quiet pull of a trigger, in the steady hand that won't let a comrade bleed alone. And in that desert hush, they finally understood what her grandfather had known all along. Some warriors don't need an audience. They only need a reason. They returned to Fort Mason as the sun climbed high, the weight of the Nevada mountains still fresh in their bones. The dust of the valley clung to their boots, a silent reminder of the lives they had taken and the ones they had saved. There was no fanfare, no applause waiting at the landing zone. The debriefing was quiet, the commanding officer's voice low and solemn. Webb's arm was in a sling, but his eyes were clear, steady on Victoria. Jackson and Thompson hovered close, the easy laughter of old routines replaced by something deeper and unspoken respect. Blackwood stood before them, his shoulders set, his jaw tight with something close to humility. He took a breath, the words thick in his throat. "Corporal Carter," he said, his voice low, "I owe you more than I can say." "We all do." His eyes met hers for a moment, and in them, there was no trace of mockery, only the quiet weight of truth. Victoria nodded once, a small, measured movement. She didn't smile, didn't revel in the apology. She simply accepted it, the way she accepted every burden placed in her hands. That night, the team gathered in the mess hall, the low hum of conversation weaving around them. Victoria sat at the edge of the room, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of black coffee. She listened more than she spoke, the steady murmur of voices like a balm after so much silence. Above the entrance to the hall hung an old photograph, her grandfather in his dress uniform, eyes like hers, steady and sure. She caught her reflection in the glass for a moment, and in that quiet space, she felt him close. She whispered a promise under her breath, a vow to carry his lessons forward. The next morning, the base gathered in the old assembly hall for a ceremony that wasn't meant to be loud. The air was heavy with the scent of brass polish and the faint tang of gun oil. Rows of soldiers stood at attention, their uniforms pressed and boots shined, the hush of the room a testament to the weight of what had happened in the desert. Victoria stood at the center, her spine straight, the desert dust still clinging to the seams of her uniform. Colonel Adams, the commander of the training program, stepped forward with a small velvet box in his gloved hands. "Corporal Victoria Carter," he said, his voice ringing clear in the quiet, "for exceptional courage under fire, for leadership that went beyond rank, and for protecting those who could not protect themselves." He pinned the medal above her heart, the silver star glinting in the light. She felt the weight of it, not as an honor, but as a reminder of what she had done and what she had chosen to carry. She didn't speak, didn't let her shoulders rise with pride. Instead, her eyes found the old portrait of her grandfather hanging at the back of the hall. In that faded photograph, she saw not just history, but a quiet promise kept. When the ceremony ended, the crowd dissolved into soft conversations, respectful nods, and the shuffle of boots on polished wood. Victoria stood for a moment longer, her hand resting lightly on the medal. She thought of Webb's quiet gratitude, of Jackson's wide-eyed awe, of the calm that had settled in Blackwood's voice. Colonel Adams found her near the doorway, his eyes kind and direct. "We're forming a new unit," he said, "a team for the next generation. We want you to lead it. Are you ready?" His words were steady, but he left space for her to decide. Victoria met his gaze, her voice calm and certain. "I'm ready," she said. "If it means I can keep protecting them." That was all that needed to be said. As the sun dipped low behind the ridge lines of Fort Mason, Victoria packed her gear in the quiet of her bunk, each buckle fastened, each strap adjusted with deliberate care. She moved slowly, the weight of her rifle across her shoulders both familiar and comforting. She stepped outside as the last light of day painted the desert in streaks of golden shadow. The air was cool, the hush of evening settling like a gentle hand. She paused at the edge of the parade ground, her breath a steady rhythm in the growing dark. From the doorway, the narrator, the quiet observer who had watched her from the start, stood and took in the sight. Victoria's silhouette was steady against the dying light, the lines of her face softened by the glow of the horizon. There was no crowd to cheer, no band to play, only the slow, measured steps of a soldier who had nothing left to prove. She walked forward, the desert stretching out ahead of her. In the hush of that golden hour, she carried more than a rifle or a medal. She carried the quiet strength of every act of kindness unspoken, every sacrifice unseen. And in that final breath of sun, she became something more than the girl they had doubted. She became a keeper of stories, a guardian of the quiet promises that hold a team together when everything else falls apart. The narrator watched her go, the weight of her presence settling in the quiet air. No applause followed her into the dusk, only the soft rustle of the wind through the dry grass, and the surety that in the silent spaces between one breath and the next, respect had found its home. Because in the end, that was all she ever needed. Not medals, not titles, just the quiet understanding that heroism doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks beside us in silence. Sometimes it leaves no mark but the knowledge that we are never truly alone. And as Victoria Carter disappeared into the long shadows of the desert night, the world seemed just a little steadier, a little braver, a little more kind. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today, someone isn't going hungry. And sometimes, that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Grateful Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.